Now, our gospel reading today is really the second half of a longer teaching that Jesus is giving about human relationships, and especially about conflict in human relationships. Last week, we heard the first half of this longer teaching. And last week, Jesus' emphasis was on accountability. That if someone causes harm, they need to accept accountability, they need to take responsibility, and they need to be willing to repair the damage they've done and commit to doing better in the future. We heard that lesson last week. And we heard Jesus seemingly be kind of harsh about accountability. He set some really clear standards for the community and seemed to suggest that if people couldn't meet those standards, perhaps they needed to go elsewhere. Although, as I pointed out last week, it's a little bit less clear precisely what he was saying about those boundaries or those standards. In any event, he definitely stressed this need for accountability in our communities. And that brings us, though, to today, right? We hear the second half of this teaching. And having just heard this lesson about accountability, Peter has, I think, a very sensible question. He says, okay, Jesus. Okay, teacher, we need to hold people accountable, but what about forgiveness? You've told us that we should forgive people, right? How do we balance accountability and forgiveness? Peter, having heard Jesus seemingly be pretty harsh about accountability, asks, can I forgive someone up to 7 times? Peter was probably thinking he was being overly generous. But here Jesus pivots entirely in his lesson and responds, no, Peter, not 7 times, but 77 times. A lot more than 7. And in fact, the Greek here is ambiguous. It could mean 77, or it could mean 70 times 7, which would be 490, an even larger number. What Jesus is, of course, suggesting is that you should essentially forgive someone an unlimited number of times. But this raises a question for Peter, and it raises a question for us. Last week, we heard about the importance of accountability, of holding each other and ourselves accountable for our actions. This week, though, all of a sudden, we're hearing about the importance of forgiveness, of releasing people, right, from their past debts to us. And it feels like these two tasks are pulling us in opposite directions. How can I hold people accountable, but also forgive them endlessly? It seems that we can't do both of these things at the same time. And yet here Jesus is telling us, yeah, you've got to do both at the same time. Hold people accountable, but also forgive them. It's a narrow track we have to navigate, I think, here. Now, this tension between Jesus' teaching last week and his teaching for us this week, I think, points us to a really critical truth about human relationships, and especially a critical truth about the work it takes to heal broken relationships. But it's a truth that I think we Christians in particular, we often get mixed up about. We often miss this truth. What we're hearing is that there are 2 distinct tasks that we must engage in if we're going to heal broken relationships, if we're going to solve conflict in our relationships. These 2 tasks, although they're related, are distinct. But as I said, we Christians, I think we often confuse them and conflate them. I think the 2 tasks that Jesus are pointing us to today are, on the one hand, forgiveness. That's relatively obvious. But the other task is reconciliation. Reconciliation. As I said, I think we Christians often confuse and mix these 2 together. We often assume that forgiveness and reconciliation are pretty much the same thing, but they're not. And I think Jesus is pointing us to that truth here. If we look at each task, I think we can see this point made clearer. Forgiveness, I think, is relatively simple to understand. Forgiveness means letting go of a debt that someone owes to us. And indeed, the word comes from the financial world, right? From basically banking and lending. If I owe you $1,000 and you forgive that debt, you're just saying, you no longer owe me the $1,000. We're striking it off the record. In the financial world, it literally means to let go of that debt. Of course, when Jesus talks about forgiving people, I think he does actually mean forgiving financial debts, but he means a lot more too, right? He's also meaning emotional and spiritual forgiveness. As he says today, we need to forgive from our heart. But the same model applies. It's about taking a debt that someone owes you. Perhaps someone has done some harm to you. And instead of holding on to your anger against them, or holding on to your resentment against them, or holding on to that grudge, somehow demanding that they repay you in some way for what they've done, forgiveness just releases that debt. You no longer owe me for what you did. It's important to see how forgiveness works. The first thing is that forgiveness is always about the past. It's always about the past. You can only forgive something that someone has actually already done. Some past debt, some past injury or harm. Forgiveness is about the past. And the other thing that's important is that forgiveness is something that we can do ourselves. Forgiveness can be unilateral. I can forgive someone no matter what that person is currently doing. Whether that person is asking for my forgiveness, whether they will accept my forgiveness. Indeed, we can forgive people this kind of spiritual and emotional debt. We can forgive people even if they've left, even if they've died. We can still forgive them. Forgiveness is unilateral. It's something that really happens within the person doing the forgiving. The person being forgiven may not even know that they're being forgiven. That can be important. I want to suggest that that fact can be really crucial. We humans often need to forgive people who have died. So this is what forgiveness is. It's unilateral, it's within one person, it's about the past. And in truth, what forgiveness is really about is it's about myself or about yourself. Forgiveness is really something that we do for ourselves, not for the other person. And that's easy to miss, right? When you hold on to anger, if you hold on to resentment, if we hold on to your grudges, what you find in life is that holding on to those things doesn't make you happier, doesn't make you more fulfilled, doesn't make you more effective. Indeed, just the opposite. Holding on to the harm that others have done to us generally makes us less happy. There's a great quote actually from the Buddha that goes like this. Buddha says, to hold on to anger against someone else is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And indeed, I think this is true. Forgiveness is something we do for ourselves. Letting go of my anger and my resentment and my grudges against other people frees me. Emotionally and spiritually, it frees me. In that sense, forgiveness is almost a selfish act, right? It's something we do for ourselves to improve our own spiritual and emotional lives. So that's forgiveness in a nutshell. What about reconciliation? Again, I think we often think these are pretty much the same, but I don't think that's true. Now, it has to be said that certainly reconciliation has to begin with forgiveness, right? If you can't forgive someone the harm they've done to you, then there's no ability to reconcile. There's no ability to kind of rebuild your relationship and have a healthy relationship going forward if you're still holding on to all of your anger. Forgiveness is the first step towards reconciliation, but it's just the first step. To reconcile means to kind of rebuild that relationship that has been broken. And in that sense, reconciliation is always about the future. Forgiveness is about the past, but reconciliation is about your future relationship. Likewise, while forgiveness is something that I can do within myself and for myself, that's just not true of reconciliation. To reconcile with someone else, that other person has to cooperate. They have to volunteer. They have to want to rebuild that relationship. Reconciliation is always a two-way process, and that means that if the other person won't cooperate, well, reconciliation just won't happen. These are the distinctions that I think are crucial. Forgiveness is a one-person action focused on the past. Reconciliation happens between people, and it's focused on the future. And it's worth noting that Jesus commands us to forgive. He does not command us to reconcile with other people. And once we've seen the distinction between the two tasks, I think we can see why. We can be commanded to forgive because forgiveness is always my choice. I can always choose to do it, no matter what others are or are not doing. But reconciliation is something that I can't do unless the other person or other people involved in that broken relationship will actually cooperate with. In that sense, I think we could argue, drawing together both half of Jesus' lesson from last week and this week, that reconciliation is really forgiveness plus accountability. Reconciliation can only occur if the person who's done the harm is willing to accept accountability for what they've done. Notice that means that we can forgive, though. We can forgive someone even if they don't accept accountability. But we can't reconcile with them if they won't accept that accountability. What we're hearing then is precisely what Jesus has said. We must forgive, and we also have to hold each other and ourselves accountable. The truth of the matter, and this is something that I think the church has often stumbled in communicating clearly. The truth of the matter is that if there are people in our lives causing us harm, and they refuse to accept accountability, they refuse to admit they've done wrong, and they refuse to commit to changing their behavior in the future, there comes a point when we may have to separate ourselves from those people just to keep ourselves safe and sane. This could apply in a church, in relationships within a congregation. It's relatively rare, but it's not unheard of. But it can also apply in our other relationships, romantic relationships, relationships with our friends or neighbors. There are relationships where so much harm is being done that it's not just acceptable, but necessary to separate ourselves from that person who's causing harm and who refuses to admit they're causing harm and refuses to even try to stop causing harm. Unfortunately, I bet that pretty much everyone listening to me right now has had at least one example of that happening. One relationship where you realized the other person won't accept accountability and I need to step back. Last week, we heard Jesus telling us that may have to happen sometimes. And I want to say that the church has done a lot of damage to people by insisting that we have to accept abuse from the people in our lives because we have to forgive them. It's true, we have to forgive them, but forgiveness doesn't mean continually accepting harm. It means letting go of the past, but it says nothing about the future. Forgiveness is that crucial step that we can take, whether the other person accepts accountability or not. Now, to say all of this, though, I don't mean to suggest that reconciliation isn't important. Indeed, I would argue that reconciliation is the goal of the church. The church is here to help make reconciliation happen between God and humankind and between human and human. That's the whole point of what we're doing, is to be reconciled to God and to each other. But having seen what reconciliation is and isn't, knowing that it's a two-way process, we can see that we can't always force reconciliation to happen. And again, I think our own experience teaches us that there are some relationships that break and are not repaired, at least not on this side of the resurrection. Meanwhile, forgiveness remains so crucial and so powerful because it's something we can do unilaterally, even if the other party won't cooperate. And again, even if reconciliation is on the table, forgiveness is always the first step. But forgiveness is worth doing even if accountability and reconciliation aren't on the table. And that's part of what Jesus is driving home in today's lesson. I hope as we continue our journey as disciples of Christ, that we'll keep this distinction between these two tasks clear, this distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation clear. Because when we confuse them, I think we cause a lot of trouble for ourselves. Sometimes leads us to not forgive people because we're not really willing or ready to reconcile. Or it sometimes leads us to continue to accept behavior that we should not accept. But seeing the distinction between the tasks, I hope, will allow us to actually do both tasks better. I hope that we'll always forgive each other and those around us. And I hope that we'll always be ready to reconcile with others, but only if genuine accountability is on the table. My friends, may it be so. Amen.